good size group. Thank you. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone, and welcome to our roundtable on exploring the disaster risk reduction and peacebuilding nexus. Thank you for coming and thank you for your interest. The wonderful thing about roundtables is that you get to put people with very diverse ideas together to just figure stuff out, right? They are this nice collective brainstorm. So hopefully we all get to collectively brainstorm around this nexus, both as part of the panel and with the audience. The way that we do this is I give a quick overview of the field and what some of the needs are. And then each of the panelists, I will introduce the panelists as they go. They will give a short presentation. We then have a discussion amongst us after all the panelists, and then you get to ask questions. We engage everyone and see where we can take this discussion. My name is Ziad Darwish. I'm both a research associate at the University of Melbourne and a senior associate with CDA Collaborative Learning Projects, which is the organization that came up with the Do No Harm approach. So thank you for being here, and let's get started. So why are we trying to talk about this intersection between peace building and disaster risk reduction? Of course, in the context of environmental peace building, it seems somewhat obvious, but in reality, it's a conversation that has basically never happened. It is very, very rare. We get these couple of scholar practitioners, and that is Peters and Peters at ODI, and we are really standing on their shoulders. They have done most of the research, they've done most of the publishing of the papers, and they are at the forefront of this thinking at the Overseas Development Institute. But in terms of practice, there is actually very, very little being done. And that's in part because both peace building often, but certainly DRR is somewhat marginal in these triple nexus discussion. So when the fields come together, try to address some of these needs and some of the challenges, then often we are the most marginal. So bringing these together, we'll see what the need says. Seems at least relevant to the four of us. So from 2004 to 2014, 58% of all disaster-related deaths and 34% of all people impacted by natural disasters occurred in fragile and conflict-affected states, which means, just according to this figure, you're a lot more likely to die from a disaster in a conflict-affected or fragile environment. My hunch is, I haven't seen comparable figures to that recently, but my hunch certainly is that these figures have increased, right? And part of that is because of this map, which we figured out. I think several of us actually use. It is a great map, and it's really essential to understand many of the discussions that are happening in terms of environmental peace building. And what they are is that actually fragility, conflict, and all sorts of disasters coincide already, right? The populations of 26 of the 39 states classified as highly fragile are at the greatest risk of exposure to chronic aridity, wildfires, floods, cyclones, rainfall abnormalities, and coastal erosion. So this trend is already there, it's already happening, but it is set to increase in many ways because of human-induced climate change. So we'll see more and more disasters in more fragile environments with more people affected. And we haven't quite figured out what that means. So certainly disaster and fragility coincide, and under certain circumstances, also violent conflict. And there is a very complex systemic relationship between these, right? There's a complex enough relationship already between fragility and conflict, even though those two we constantly talk about. The relationship is really complex and very case specific, but disaster figures into that. So we now have to start to understand and assess these different dynamics and see how, on the whole, they make the impact of each of them possibly worse. And some of them might present some opportunities too. The reason why, or one of the reasons why, and as said, the data isn't clear because there isn't so much comparative data, but one of the reasons why the death toll seems to be so much higher of disasters in fragile and conflict-affected areas is that fragility limits adaptive capacities. Basically, fragile states aren't very good at preventing deaths from disasters, and they're not very good at responding to them. And certainly if states are actually affected by violent conflict, there is very little in terms of governance that can be done. As you might know, disaster response is about governance, right? Not just governance by states, but formal and informal institutions, international development institutions, and very, very often in both interstate and civil conflict, we have governance issues. So delivering food, infrastructures are weak, regulations are weak. There's also another dynamic in that, and that is that if violent conflict is happening, violent conflict is already degrading resources. And so a lot of resources, there's certainly food security issues often mixed into this. So we're talking about these complex adaptive systems that are operating and intersecting constantly. And it's important for us to untangle some of these relationships. So this is always happening, and my Zoom is in the way. So there's case-specific evidence that disasters can actually lead to violent conflict, and that's particularly in fragile states. And the pathways, there's several pathways, but disasters, if they're not addressed by the government, can often lead to rioting. And those riots, under certain circumstances, can turn violent. But there's also a lot of evidence, and particularly this evidence comes post-2005 tsunami, there is actually a lot of cooperation after disasters, both interstate and internally between warring factions, that at least immediately after a disaster, fighting often stops and people cooperate across conflict lines, meaning we have an opportunity there as peace builders. So there's also some now very, very isolated evidence. And really a lot of this, whenever we say that we don't have the evidence, one of the first things we need to do is produce it. There is some isolated evidence that integrating social cohesion programming with disaster preparedness can actually turn compound risks into compound benefits, which means if we have frameworks to assess and address these together, we can actually turn negative impacts into positive impacts. Or there seems to be some evidence that there's a possibility to do this. What we need is more evidence, right? So a most recent article, once again by these forerunners in this field, Peters and Peters, have recently called this link between disaster risk reduction and peace building a terra incognita, an unknown world, right? Something that we can think about at the moment, and they're doing a lot of the thinking, but we don't quite understand anything about it. We haven't really thought about assessment frameworks on a large scale. We haven't really thought about commonalities in addressing these issues. So far, we don't know anything about it. I don't know what the way forward is. Certainly the way forward is a lot more case study research and then comparative research out of that. Ideally case studies that are well enough designed that we can compare them both across time and space. But we got to bring DRR more centrally into the triple nexus, right? The way that we talk about all of these things together today, the framework that we often approach it by is triple nexus discussion, but DRR hardly ever figures into those discussions. So there's really an opportunity for us to bring DRR more into that. So we have to come up with some compounded risk frameworks. First, the frameworks to understand, and then response mechanisms that allow us to sort of coordinate some of this work. There's particularly great sort of low-hanging fruit seems to be prevention and preparedness, because a lot of the frameworks already, disaster risk frameworks, but also food security frameworks, they often have conflict, they often collect conflict data. So we have overlapping data already that's being collected on a large scale, and increasingly this collection is being done through AI. So really prevention and preparedness is the low-hanging fruit where we could do a lot. And that is all I have to say. Thank you. And we can do questions afterwards. I'll stop my share and introduce my dear colleague, Langdon Greenhawk. Langdon is a professional international emergency response manager who is a CEO of Global Emergency Group, a humanitarian consulting firm and president of Global Emergency Relief and Recovery and Reconstruction, which is a nonprofit that enables crisis-affected persons globally to build back better. As a professional international disaster manager, Mr. Greenhawk has led humanitarian operations and consulting teams throughout the world since 1999. His recent work has focused on disaster management, leadership, data analytics, digital transformation, anticipatory action, green recovery, and disaster risk financing. He's a graduate of the Kennedy School at Harvard and the University of Virginia, where he also currently serves as a board member for the UA Spaten School of Leadership. Thank you, Langdon, for being here. By your bio, everything I've just said, you have something interesting to contribute, clearly. So thank you, and please go ahead.
Yes, hello. This is just such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Said. As you said, and it brings me back to some of my my reflections in terms of the work that I've done. You mentioned the tsunami, for example. I was in Aceh following the Indonesia tsunami that happened there, and saw directly in terms of the efforts that the International Committee of the Red Cross had at that time. I was working with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Their efforts in terms of how to facilitate and support peace building efforts in that area really jumped forward in a significant way at that particular point in time, ways that weren't possible prior to the tsunami. So I've seen firsthand the effect of these types of situations and how that does indeed create opportunities. It also creates obviously massive challenges that you would never want for any communities, but those opportunities do exist. I also worked in Chad, again for the International Red Cross, building a refugee camp for 15,000 people that is still there. This was back in 2005. And the environmental consequences related to the design and how we set up these types of humanitarian interventions is really, really significant. And the way that then plays into obviously the significant risk recovery elements that are essential going ahead just cannot be emphasized enough. So just to say, I've seen this on the humanitarian side at the front edges of it, if you will, and it is significant. And we have some huge challenges. And I'd like to focus on five areas for consideration by everybody here to talk and think through. I think this dialogue is really important because I think the first area is really breaking down silos. We talk about humanitarian development, peace building, all kinds of different sectors, if you will, within this wider endeavor. And those silos are artificial and have been there for a long time in a lot of respects. And that's why this type of discussion and dialogue, I think, is just so essential, and I appreciate you all bringing us together to have this. I think if we break down those silos, we'll all be in a better position to find ways to really listen to the communities. And that would be my second major point. The humanitarian sector has been spending a lot of time on a localization agenda focused on how do we really fundamentally listen and empower and support local communities and really focus on the community requirements. And the organization I work with and help to found, GER3, really places the needs of the community at the center. And how we, when we consider all of this going ahead, continue to let those voices, and CDA has played just a critical role in that process from the very beginning with Mary Anderson and some of those approaches in terms of actually listening to the communities, but continually bringing us back to that. The third major area that I would suggest where we have a lot of common interests is really on finding political solutions to these conflict situations. It was great to hear Martin Griffiths, the new head of the emergency response coordinator for the United Nations and the IASC system, stand up, and he's a past mediator himself, has worked in a lot of peace building situations, say that these are political solutions that need to be identified and advanced, and the humanitarian sector has a lot to do with that and advancing that. So I think those political solutions and really focusing on that from all different angles within the community is really important going ahead. The further area that I think we need to consider is really, and this is my fourth major point, if you go break down silos, you look at political solutions, you listen to the community. The fourth area is really addressing the money problem. In the humanitarian space, we estimate that 50% of global humanitarian funding gaps exist. So we're only getting 50% of what we need to meet the humanitarian requirements. Of the humanitarian funds that go out there, it's 30.9 billion last year, for example. About 1.9 billion of that then went to disaster risk reduction funding. So not only do we not have enough to meet humanitarian needs, but such a small percentage of that is going towards the disaster risk reduction funding that's needed to really look at some of the underlying root causes and really anticipatory elements that can be done in advance to prepare for disasters and thereby reduce the risks and the harmful impacts. Related to addressing the money problem is, I think, disaster risk financing. So alternative means of financing. We look at this, multiple funding instruments that are arranged in advance of a disaster to cover the costs of preparation, response, recovery, and reconstruction. So we have to look at alternative ways of funding this going ahead. These are instruments like impact bonds, forecast-based financing, replicate insurance, sovereign disaster risk financing instruments. All of these really need to be considered within the frameworks and ways of working going forward, because these gaps are so massive. I think we also need to look at this intermediation, which is where we're taking some of these larger systems, processes, bureaucracies that have been inserted into the system in a lot of different ways, and look at how we remove some of that so that it is more effective and more efficient. And then the fifth area that I would offer are just new tools and approaches. We can't keep doing things the same way we always have. We have to look at new ways of really addressing some of these massive challenges that we face. And climate change is just so huge in so many different ways, and how that is exacerbating the effects of conflict are so clear in so many different ways. Some of these new tools really look at anticipatory action. So we're getting better and better data. The Informed Risk Index is a great example of this. Some of the work that's being done by ACAPS, that's the Assessment Capacity Building Project, on the crisis insight, looking at how crises will evolve and how we can prepare for those. Looking at how artificial intelligence enables that, how we do better risk modeling associated with that as well. So I think when we look at tools, when we look at approaches, there's a good amount happening in the humanitarian space for sure. But when we start to break down these silos, we start to understand, okay, what's happening on the peace building side? What's happening in some of these other areas? And we get to some of the key solutions, and we look at alternative approaches that are going to be essential going ahead. So those are just a few comments. I'm really interested in everybody else's questions and thoughts and the presentations for others. So I'll just concede my time from there and move on to you. Please, back to you.
Thank you, Langdon. That was really wonderful. And actually, one of the points that you really brought home for me is that the assessment tools are kind of there, right?
Sure.
Especially evolving, like we actually have assessment tools that go across all of these silos. We just don't really have frameworks and actions afterwards. So thank you for that. We'll move forward, and then we have a discussion afterwards and question after all of our panelists. Let me introduce Dr. Elise Ramling. Dr. Elise Ramling is an associate researcher with CIPRI's Climate Change and Risk Program. Her work focuses on how climate and environmental change impact on human security and how international organizations are thinking about and responding to climate-related security risks. Elise has a background in both academic and policy-oriented research in the field of climate change and sustainable development, with expertise on the social implications of climate change. Her research has centered particularly on the processes of adaptation to climate change at different levels of governance. Her work has been published in high-impact academic journals, including Climate Policy, Environmental Politics, Climate and Development, and Regional Environmental Change. Elise is a research fellow with the Earth Systems Governance Project. Thank you, Elise, and please go ahead.
Great, thank you, Sia. Let me just pull up my presentation. Can you see that all right? Yeah, okay, cool. Great, thank you. And yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here and speak with all of you and listen to all of you. I want to shift the focus a little bit from disaster risk reduction to sort of a related field of work, which is climate change adaptation. And of course, climate change adaptation can include a lot of the measures that, build resilience to sudden disasters and also reduce humanitarian needs, but it can also include, responses to more long-term, slow onset climate. So more on the sort of socio-economic development intervention spectrum, if you wish. And in my opening statement, I'm just going to offer a couple of reflections from work that I did together with my colleague Annick Barnhorn at CIPRI, which is part of a bigger project that CIPRI is undertaking called the Environmental Peace, which will launch a report in May this year. So keep a lookout for that, which looks at the intersection between environmental change and conflict. We've already seen this slide from Siad, but I guess what it highlights is a couple of different things, maybe to add to what Siad was saying earlier. I mean, we see there's a big overlap between those regions that are particularly vulnerable to climate change and that are affected by conflict. And these things, was mentioned previously, are of course, in a way, two sides of the same coin, because they're not two distinct factors, but aspects like governance and insecurity of livelihoods, etc., of course, increases the risk to climate change. But what this also tells us is that we really need climate adaptation efforts in particularly fragile and conflict affected states. And I think that is very interesting, because if you look at some of the finance flows, and maybe we can talk a bit more about this later, we can see that actually most of the adaptation finance currently is not flowing into these regions. It's flowing into different kind of spaces. So there's, of course, this double burden. And what Annick and I wanted to sort of find out, and this is a bit, I guess, a bit more from an academic angle than maybe from a practitioner side, is what do we actually know about the connection between climate change, conflict, and peace building? And I'm just going to offer 4 different observations. So the first one is that we actually know very little about the connection between these 3. So there's quite limited discussion of peace and conflict dynamics in the adaptation literature. There is a discussion in adaptation sort of practitioner and research fields around maladaptation. So that are the unintended effects from adaptation interventions. And there's some discussion in this space around increased human insecurity as a result of an intervention. So this can relate to food or water or livelihoods, etc. But these kind of concerns have not really extended to sort of conflict and insecurity at sort of broader levels. So if we look at, for instance, some of the guidelines from climate funds or development organizations that are starting to pick up on this risk of maladaptation, so far there's no real consideration of conflict and peace dynamics. The second observation is that in this sort of limited sample of studies that actually look at these dynamics, there appear to be 4 riskier types of adaptation interventions. And these are interventions that impact on land and land use. So, altering access to forests, water, land, and other kind of resources, including food. So the question of land tenure is a really big one here. These are adaptation projects that focus on infrastructure. So this could be seawalls or dams, irrigation, that force people to migrate or move, or that give primacy to central priorities over local ones. So, Langdon was talking about the sort of efforts to localize some of these projects. And I think this is really key to make sure that it doesn't impact negatively. And I mean, these things are not rocket science. People that have, been working in peace building and conflict, it's clear that these factors are, very important when it comes to these mitigating pathways that that Siad was talking about before. The third observation is that of the sort of academic and grey literature that discusses the interaction between conflict and climate change and adaptation, most actually talk about non-violent forms of conflict and at the community level. So there's no real studies that show that adaptation interventions, for instance, exacerbate conflict dynamics at higher sort of geographical levels. And there's also often in studies sort of hypotheticals, there could potentially be increased conflict if this and that happens, but the evidence for this is really thin. And And then the fourth observation, and I think this is really interesting, is that there's actually very weak evidence on the adaptation peace-building link. So much of the focus is, if there is a focus, it is on the conflict side, but not on the peace-building side, so on the positive interactions. And we see that there's a little bit of anecdotal evidence mentioned often by think tanks that are recommending certain tools, but this is not really substantiated from a sort of, evidence point of view. It doesn't mean that there is no link, but we actually don't know. So just drawing this together, it's easy, we can sort of think of it as 4 different types of interactions between these dynamics. On the left-hand side, we have sort of the maladaptation work. So when we have an adaptation intervention, it might increase conflict risks. Then in the second column, we have this, positive idea that adaptation can actually contribute to sustainable peace building. But we don't really have enough evidence for this. Then in the next column, we have this dynamic where underlying conflict dynamics have a negative impact on the vulnerability situation and increase the risk for adaptation. And then in the final column, and I think that's something that is not really discussed at all, and I find that quite an interesting thought, is that of course in some instances conflict can be positive in the sense that it can make adaptation more sustainable if it helps overcome structural violence in specific places that have caused vulnerability to climate change in the first place. So just sort of to wrap this up, we actually know very little about these dynamics. Some of the policy recommendations that we see out there have preceded rigorous empirical analysis, and we rely often on anecdotal evidence and analogues. So I think this links very well to something that Siad said in the beginning. We really need to know more. And we need both sort of academic empirical studies, but also we need to improve on the learning side. And I think what's really key here is that we need systematic, independent, and also publicly available monitoring and evaluation of some of these dynamics. And done right, adaptation can be, development work and peace building work. But at the moment, from what we've seen in sort of the studies, there's very little evidence that adaptation interventions are conflict sensitive. And that means that they're sort of double blind, both in terms of the underlying conflict dynamics in the past and present, but also to the unintended effects that this intervention can have on the security environment, sort of both ways in a way. And maybe linking as well to the conversations about silos that we had, is that really it's very evident, I think, that we need to sort of work across some of these communities of practice. And again, sort of, I like what you said before, that, a lot of these assessment tools are there. We don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel, but there needs to be more interaction between these fields. And I think, Katie Peters has done a great job at taking some of these really important steps to integrate. I think I will leave it at that, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. One of my favorite things at a conference is if somebody answers or pulls together a set of knowledge that you really wanted to know about. And there is, exactly as Elise said, if you are a practitioner in this field, everyone's talking about maladaptation and conflict. Right? It really is, maladaptation conflict is in the discussion, but the evidence really isn't there. So thank you, Elise. You really pulled something together for me there and made a lot more sense, something that I've been quite concerned with, and I think a lot of us are. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. But let me move over to Enzo for now. Dr. Vincenzo Boletino, sorry, just went into, there we are. Dr. Vincenzo Boletino is the director of the Resilient Communities program at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. Prior to his current appointment, Dr. Boletino served for 5 years as executive director of the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. His research and professional experience include disaster resilience, humanitarian action, civil-military engagement in emergencies, and humanitarian leadership. He has spent the past 20 years of his career at Harvard University in administration, teaching, and research. The current research focuses on disaster preparedness and resilience, humanitarian leadership, climate change, and civil-military engagement during humanitarian emergencies. Dr. Boletino has taught courses on research design, peace building, and international politics at Harvard, and is the author of publications related to disaster preparedness, climate change, and humanitarian action. Dr. Boletino completed his PhD at the Graduate School of International Studies at the University of Denver, and currently serves as an advisory committee member of the MSF Speaking Out case studies, and is former board member of the Enhancing Learning and Research for Humanitarian Assistance, and former president of the ACF International Scientific Council Action Against Hunger. Thank you, Enzo, and please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Siad, and it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I'm very happy to have been given an invitation to share some of the work that I'm doing. So as Siad mentioned, I'm Vincenzo Boletino. I work at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. A lot of the work that I do is on disaster preparedness and resilience. It's research that's population based, so a lot of survey research. And much of this is in Southeast Asia, particularly in the Philippines. So much of what I say here will draw on that research. I've also engaged in humanitarian leadership and civil military coordination research as well, but predominantly focused on disaster preparedness and resilience. My first foray to the Philippines was in 2013, right after Typhoon Haiyan, locally called Yolanda, which was really a wake-up call for the Philippines. It really drove home, I think, 2 points. One, amongst many. One was that climate change impacts are real, and the country, despite the fact that it's one of the most disaster vulnerable in the world and receives anywhere between 20 and 25 typhoons a year, had not experienced a typhoon of the magnitude of Haiyan. And a lot of the communications and sort of scientific knowledge wasn't readily understood in some of the warnings that were given about, for example, storm surges. And so the resulting destruction and deaths were significant, and it was really a wake-up call for the country to really focus on the impact of climate change on disaster preparedness and response. The second piece of it was that there was such a large international response that they drew the lesson that they really wanted to be able to develop this capacity themselves. And so I've really invested a lot, both at the government level, the private sector level, to really be prepared for future disasters. Having said that, they just experienced a recent typhoon Odette, which was also quite destructive, not quite as much so as Haiyan, but still laid significant destruction in the country. I will cover a couple of things here and have some observations from the research that we've done that will mirror what my other colleagues, Lees and Langdon, have said as well as Siad. So one of the things is that globally speaking, the international humanitarian community is really not poised or positioned, does not have the resources, capacity to be able to face the consequences of the kinds of disasters we're beginning to already experience and will be experiencing more of because of climate change. And this is an issue not simply because of lack of resources, but because of the changing nature of these things, where they're actually happening, and the fact that there are many other factors involved in terms of whether a country is prepared to deal with a disaster effectively. So a lot of these solutions are going to have to be locally based. And so understanding and knowing and listening to local voices is a huge part of this, and facilitating and bolstering local capacity is going to be a huge part of preparing countries that are currently highly vulnerable and may lack some capacity to be able to face these challenges in the future. The second piece is that there's really not a whole lot of really good, strong empirical evidence looking at the interlinkages between peace building on the one hand, and disaster risk reduction, disaster preparedness research on the other. Having said that, yes, we have the problem of silos, but we also have the problem of not necessarily doing a lot of research that's focused, population-based research that's focused on understanding the attitudes and behaviors of people on the ground in these contexts. And so doing that kind of research will be instrumental to effectively being able to analyze the situation on the ground, which will in turn at least provide some common material for both the peace-building communities and disaster risk reduction communities to be able to speak to. So a few observations from a large survey that we did in the Philippines in 2017. At that time, we collected just over 5,000 surveys across the country. We utilized quite an intensive participatory process to come up with the survey questions. So we had both key stakeholder interviews with professionals from every range of disaster response organization to disaster preparedness, civil society organizations, but also with communities, where we held focus group discussions and brought community members together to be able to ask them what were the kinds of things they were observing, what were the kinds of things that information they wish they had, what were the kinds of activities that they actually participated in to prepare for disasters, and what was their experience with previous disasters, and how did they view and understand climate change, and what were the linkages between their perceptions of climate change and what they actually did to undertake any preparedness for future disasters. So there's some really interesting information that came out of this. So one was, and here I'll draw a general observation, and that is that people's expectations and their hopes may not match up with their experience and what they're currently observing or what they've experienced in the past. So one of the questions that we asked was, whose role is it to respond to a disaster once it's happened? The vast majority of people said that it was the responsibility of the local government unit, so their local government. They also thought the national government had a strong responsibility, and that their own families should be responsible as well. They actually didn't feel like either the international community through international NGOs or national civil society organizations had a major responsibility to respond to disasters. It really fell to government to do this. Then we asked households what their opinion was on whose responsibility it was to prepare for future disasters. And again, the local government unit was the most significant. Family scored high and national government high as well. They didn't think that international and national NGOs had as much responsibility. Now, when we look at their actual experience, that is, if a natural disaster were to happen, and based on their past experience with natural disaster response, what actually happened, where did this actual aid come from? 2/3 of them said it was from their families. And then a significant amount said from the national government, but only about half as many said that the local government unit was as effective as in responding or was actually responding as compared to how many felt they had a responsibility to do so. And interestingly here, in terms of their experience with actual response, NGOs, both local and international, played a much larger role than they felt they had a responsibility to do. Again, this is a survey that's representative. This is at the national level data that I'm giving you here, and it's representative of the population of the Philippines, adult population at least. Then taking a look at some of the preparedness activities, the second point or observation I want to make is that these resources are distributed in a very different way across the country. They're not equally distributed, and so being able to drill down to the specific context is extremely important. And one of the things that we see here as well, that fragile contexts, conflict-affected contexts like the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, which is called the BARM here on the top left, had some of the fewest resources that they were able to put towards disaster preparedness. And we looked at 3 dimensions of preparedness: people's involvement in training for disasters, people's involvement in planning, and people's actual material investment. And that material investment could be in houses, it could be in putting go bags together, or other sorts of materially focused preparedness activities. And so here you can see a really big difference between resource poor and more resource wealthy areas. And there's also some interesting division between those regions that are hit by typhoons, for example, very frequently, and where a lot of international actors were involved, like in Eastern Visayas, where you see a large number of people putting investments into their homes, and very little in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Mindanao. So the basic two takeaways here are that things are not distributed equally. People's experiences are very different. Fragile and conflict-affected contexts are the places that, although they're affected by natural hazards, the people are the least likely and they have the fewest resources to deal with. And so that's, I think, a really important factor to be looking at. Then finally, I'll just, I'll end with this one because I realize that I'm spending a bit more time than I had planned. Looking at these odds ratios, you can see here some really interesting things. So if you look across the top panel, these are different actions to prepare for disaster, different preparedness dimensions, training, planning, and material investment. And if you look at some of these odds ratios, I'll point to some. So if people believe they were impacted by climate change or had greater knowledge of climate change, they were more likely to be engaged in preparedness activities. And this is controlling for gender, for age, and for levels of education. If they were involved in an association, so strong social cohesion measures were highly associated with engagement in, particularly in training, and as well as in overall actions to prepare for disasters. So this is interesting because it points to the need for awareness raising and education around climate change and disasters because they have an impact on people's actual proclivity to engage in preparedness activities. Then the final dimension that I'll mention here is sort of psychosocial health and well-being. I didn't present the data here because it's not published yet, but I have a paper that's being put together now. And one of the preliminary findings is that people's sense of self-awareness, their sense of self-agency, that is, if they have a positive outlook that they can affect change, that is highly correlated with their willingness and likelihood of their preparing for disasters. I'll stop with that, and we can take it to the discussion section for any questions you might have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Enzo. Once again, my favorite kind of research is research that not just reveals new ways of thinking about a particular scenario and in practical and offers practical ways forward. And I can absolutely second the psychosocial aspects. And so we don't think about them enough in terms of disaster, the psychosocial aspects that we're going to face in terms of disaster across the world. So thank you, Enzo. I will start us off with one question, and then we can open it up to the audience. And Enzo, there's somebody for you here in the chat also that has contributed to this research. And my question to the three of you is, breaking down silos, what are some of the concepts that might help us to do that? What is the kind of language that we share in common? What, if we would want to focus on breaking down silos, what would be the one of the first 2 or 3 concepts that we could look at, tackle, and open up from different perspectives? Any of you, please.
Well, I can maybe kick us off with some thoughts. I mean, I think, at least from my work on climate change adaptation and maladaptation, I think it all really comes back to the concept of vulnerability and vulnerability reduction. And I think having sort of a comprehensive understanding of what that means is something that I think would probably be equally, valid for disaster risk reduction. I mean, like I mentioned before, I'm not really a practitioner and I'm not an expert on DRR, but I think what we see in the sort of adaptation side is that even nowadays, we still see a lot of focus of projects on sort of the climate impact side. So they look at, okay, here's a hazard, what will it do? How much rainfall will we have? So that's their sort of angle on vulnerability. Whereas what I think, a lot of people that are concerned with maladaptation and that have worked a lot on the ground, they really emphasize a more contextual understanding and what are the sort of socioeconomic, political economy dynamics that feed into vulnerability. So I think for me, that's a concept that probably stretches a lot across these different areas of work.
Thank you so much, Elise. Absolutely. Yes, Langdon, please.
Maybe just a few more for consideration as well. We mentioned the needs assessment side of things, but there's been a lot done on the humanitarian side in terms of these assessment frameworks. Also, how we do situational awareness is another term that we use in terms of fully understanding the context and all the different dynamics that come into that. So how we contextualize and have robust situational awareness, I think is something else to consider. And what are all the factors that are coming into play? We also talk about livelihoods. And obviously, when we're talking about moving from a conflict situation to a post-conflict situation, how people have the opportunity to earn again and become active in such a way and recover from both the conflict situation, potentially in a lot of cases, the disaster situation that they've been involved in is really important. So how we look at the economics around livelihoods and the creation of livelihood opportunities for those people who have gone through those types of situations from a community perspective. And I really like, Enzo, the work that you're doing in terms of the research, and Elise as well, in terms of getting that community understanding and really is essential there. And maybe the third is just accountability to affected populations. Like, how are we really ensuring that accountability in terms of what we are collectively doing is at the highest possible levels, and we have good, strong frameworks and research and monitoring and evaluation that underpins a lot of that accountability. Over.
Great, excellent. Thank you, Langdon. Enzo?
Yeah, I would just add from what I thought both Elise and Langdon had excellent responses there. So I'll be very brief and just say one observation from a COVID-19 symposium that we held for authors in the Philippines. So these sorts of conferences like this one that we're participating in right now are so effective for beginning to bridge silos and have people see and understand what is happening in the field. But one thing I did with that particular symposium, and it was closed and then later broadcast, was that we only took papers from Filipino authors. And so we only looked at those papers. We took the best amongst them with 4 or 5 different people evaluating them, and then had them present their own results in this symposium for them. And then we sort of blasted out in social media and the recordings, and national media then picked up their research and started writing articles about it in the country. And so raising the profile of local people, including them, and presenting their research is really crucial. And I think is really needed in these kinds of venues and settings. And then making sure that they are available to people beyond those who are having a conversation within a closed conference that may not be aware of it. I mean, I've been researching for years and years, and I've never been to any discussion of environmental peace building. And I'm someone with a PhD doing research, so you have to be able to raise awareness broadly to be able to begin to shed light on some of these things, and bringing in local voices and elevating those voices is an important way to do that.
I really like that all of us essentially talk about power all the time and the power imbalances, and how all of this is about addressing power imbalances, right? And particularly the ones between local and supposedly global. So I'm glad that the 4 of us sort of speak the same language and come from the same background. But thank you. I'd like to open it up to the audience, and the audience can either raise your hand, your virtual hand, of course, or you can post a question in the chat and I'll read it to whoever you pose the question to. So if you put in the chat, also maybe indicate who you would like to answer that question. So open for questions from the audience.
Can I maybe jump in and ask a question to Enzo?
Absolutely.
Great. I really found the survey results from the Philippines really fascinating, and I think there's a real need to have more of those local studies really trying to work out people's perceptions, etc. And I also like what you pointed out, that the distribution of climate finance is not, or DRR finance and investment, however you would like to call it, is not only unequally distributed if you look across developing countries at national level, but there's of course also really differences at the subnational level. I think that's excellent. One thing that I was curious about was whether in the disaster response, so when you looked at people's experiences of disaster response in real life. Was there a difference in the terms of the temporal aspect of these sort of responses? So I think you said that family was sort of for 60% or 66% was like the first or the main response to a disaster situation. Did you check at all for the temporal aspect? So, you know, I can just, like, for instance, I was part of I was here when the bushfires raged in the Black Summer fires in Australia. And it was really interesting, the sort of different sequencing, I guess, of responses. So that's why I was curious to ask.
Yeah, thank you, Elise. Those are excellent questions. So just a couple of quick responses. One, the specific data that you mentioned in terms of the distribution, or looking at who was responding and who was sort of responsible and what their actual experience was. That data was national level data. I didn't do the, and I'm sure regionally it would be very different from one region to another. But because there are 18 different regions and we had limited, in the Philippines, and we had limited amount of time here, I didn't present all of that data. But there are papers that I've published and reports that are available that I'm happy to make available to everyone that go into much more detail. The second piece about the temporality of it, no, it was a cross-sectional study. Yes, I do think the temporal piece is huge. And so we're doing two things. One, we'll do another nationwide household level survey. They're obviously enormously expensive and hard to do and take a long time. But are really important. So we'll do that. But we're also trying to do something a little bit more economical, although I don't know how representative it's going to be, in creating like a kind of disaster preparedness scorecard that people can take online and then sort of generate their own score based on how others have responded, for them to get a sense of how prepared they are. And that will be linked to resources and other things depending on, you know, how they answer. But the much more rigorous piece will be to do another representative household level survey across the country, which we plan to do actually both in the Philippines and we'll be starting to do work in Nepal as well.
There is an interesting question here in the chat by C. Kelly, and it is a question to Enzo, but it's probably an interesting question for all of us to think about, and it is about scale, right? So scale in the sense of individual, household, community, and so on. So she's asking if not maybe from your data, Enzo, the household is the most important scale in terms of response, and that we should focus on rather than states of conflict affected areas. And that, of course, is an interesting question for this intersection also, because as peace builders, we either look at group dynamics or individual, right, or state, but we rarely look at household. So if that's the case, it actually says something interesting about this nexus, that we might be out of tune when it comes to scale. So does anyone want to go in terms of scale?
I'm happy to quickly just make one. It was an excellent question. I have two quick responses. One, as long as it's good data and is truly representative, then data at multiple scales is better. The more good data you have, the better. And particularly if it's at different levels of analysis or different units of analysis. And so ideally you would want to have data from different units of analysis and basically triangulate the different data sources that you have to see what's happening at different sort of levels of analysis. I do think household level data is really important, and attitudes and behaviors are really important to understanding what's going to work and not work in terms of policy or programming. I just think it's so difficult to do it because it's expensive and time consuming. You know, it took us 1.5 years to create the survey because we wanted it to be representative and the questions to come from people who are in the community amongst professionals themselves. And so, yeah, we can do it again, obviously much faster for the Philippines because we can revise our current instrument. But if we go to Nepal, it's going to take another 1.5 years to create an instrument. And so it will be 2 years before we have data analyzed at the household level. So it takes a lot of resources. It's quite intensive, but it is really important data, but not the only data. I mean, it should be with all kinds of, it should be looked at ideally with all kinds of other data that's available, not just perception data.
And to add to that, understand as an anthropologist, understanding governance in different cultural sectors is, my hunch would be that the scale is contextual. Which scale is more important, right? That probably if you do a similar survey in Sweden, 90% of the people would expect national government to respond, right? It might be, we don't know, but I'm saying that the scale is probably very context specific, cultural, to do with government capacities and so on. So it'd be interesting to have more comparative data of that kind, of course. Anyone else wants to talk to scale? Okay, otherwise, any other questions from the audience? Does anyone want to raise their hand and actually show their face? It'd be lovely to see some of you. We've all been locked down for so long. It'd be nice to reach out and see and hear your voices. So does anyone have any questions, even in person or in the chat, to any of our panelists? Okay, nothing so far. So what I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into is then how does DRR practice look differently in fragile and conflict affected states? How do we need to adapt it for this kind of context, states or contexts? What is it about DRR that is different in these contexts, and what needs to happen to make it? And of course, we've heard financing is a big part of that, right? None of the financing seems to go that way, even though most of the impact is there. But what else needs to happen in order to make DRR more effective in those contexts?
I would love to hear what people with more. I don't know the answer to that, and I think it's an excellent question. I have some hunches and assumptions that I could make. But it's one of the areas that I would love to do research on. So I don't want to just throw guesses out there, since they're not really grounded in empirical evidence. They would just be hypotheses. But I would love to hear if anyone has, if anyone here in the group has that.
I think this is mostly what we have. But both Langdon and Elise's presentation actually speaks a little bit to that. So if anyone has some ideas, let's just throw guesses out.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we noticed when we were doing our literature review, and again, my background is more in adaptation, so I'm quite, more familiar with the debate around how to avoid maladaptation and some of these negative contexts. It seemed to me like there was a striking overlap with some of the, what we at CIPRI call sort of the pathways between environmental changes or climate changes and conflict. It was almost like you could layer sort of the factors that cause maladaptation with the factors that it can, lead to conflict or increased insecurity. And that speaks a bit to the question, or to the point that I tried to make at the end. Like, it seems to me like we don't really need to reinvent the wheel, but it's really about finding those shared concepts, Siad, that you were sort of talking about. So it seemed to me like, I mean, obviously conflict affected and fragile states are sort of a much more complicated space to navigate in. But the actual sort of responses, so, paying attention to some of these underlying contextual dynamics, looking particularly at, political economy dynamics, at exclusionary processes, at unequal benefits and burdens, and also especially at elite capture, are also factors that, seem to work across different areas. So maybe I wonder if some of these core factors are actually particularly different, or whether it's just on a spectrum of negative implications. It's just sort of more risky or more amplified, let's say, in conflict affected states. But I'm just speculating here.
It sounds very likely what you're saying, I think. Absolutely. I know I have similar observations. Langdon, please.
Yeah, maybe just an observation. I don't have the answer either, and I think the only way to get to the answer is by doing some of the hard work that our colleagues here are doing, and from a research standpoint, but also having these types of dialogues and expanding it even wider. And that's something I think we should seriously consider, how you expand this more significantly to include other groups, other entities that have a role and a stake in all of this. But I think one element that I would consider is we're spending so much of our time and our effort and our energy. You look at a Syria type of context, you look at Yemen, this is year after year, huge amount of effort, resourcing, just everything that goes into that. And obviously the loss of life and the tragedy of it drags on. And that takes its toll as well. But what we're doing as well, by not addressing directly these situations and having them take up so much space, so much time, energy, and resourcing, is we're not leaving the space for DRR. We're not leaving the space for a lot of the work that needs to be done on climate change and adaptation. There's a real need to address some of these longstanding crises that have extended for such a long period of time now, so that we have the space to focus and get our energies to the next major challenge that we all see in the battle that we're in terms of climate change adaptation. And how do we shift the focus from where it has been for so long now in some of these crises to that. Over.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, basically one of the things that Langdon says is we actually have to do it. We have to begin to do it at all in crisis and conflict affected areas, right? Actually start doing DRR in particularly these protracted conflicts. So, and then, right, think about it and do the research, but also start doing it and trying to assess what that actually means. So DRR is not getting the attention, and I think that there's broad agreement. DRR is not getting the attention it needs everywhere financially in terms of practice. Still open to the audience if the audience would like to ask any questions. We don't know at the intersection what we're talking about. We're making this up as we go along. So there really is only enlightening questions because we don't know very much about this intersection. So anyone that would like to raise a hand or pose a question in the chat, any questions to any of us or all of us? There's a question by Andrew Moore. Conflict conversation is about, it feels a bit like the climate conflict conversation is about where the triple-nexus conversation was in 2016, where there's a bit of a lag between the recognition of the challenge and the development of funding mechanisms and research to identify a solution. Is that accurate? How can we speed up the pace of putting this into practice? What would your ideal program look like and who would it involve? This is a great question. I quickly can answer that. I've recently been on an internal panel with all the major funders in the world about looking at greater climate funding to fragile and conflict affected states more generally. It wasn't just focused on DRR, it was also about adaptation, but it was actually about pouring a lot more money on climate adaptation and DRR into fragile and conflict affected states. And that was all the main donors sitting together. So hopefully that is actually happening. And often where the money goes, the action then follows. So, but this question, how can we speed up the integration process and put this into practice? And what would your ideal program look like? And who would it involve? Anyone?
I'm happy to just jump in and say that I would love to basically take the same process that we did around looking at disaster preparedness at the national, with the national level survey, and then focus in on a particularly fragile context. Could be in the Philippines and Mindanao, for example, where there's both latent and sporadic acute conflict, and be able to undertake the development of a research instrument that was sensitive both to conflict and disasters, and see what people's behaviors and attitudes are. And similarly, Other research that I'm involved in and I think would be really useful here would be a network analysis across the peace building, climate adaptation, development, humanitarian sort of actors, and looking at what are the both international, national, and local, looking at where what kinds of information is being exchanged, who's exchanging it. When we did this in the Philippines, we found a couple of things. One, a lot of the relationships were like just about extracting already sort of developed information. So they were just like pulling reports. And two, when international actors were pulled out, something like 70% of the relationships broke down. And so international actors were acting as kind of a hub for many of the local actors. So knowing that and understanding that is important for thinking about policy and programming, because ideally local actors are connected with their own and other local actors near them and to national actors. So I think one, a population-based research that focuses on conflict and disaster preparedness, disaster risk reduction, and two, network analyses across this sort of nexus would be two things that I would undertake.
Thank
you, Enzo. Anyone else?
Maybe just
oh, sorry. Go ahead, Langdon.
Right of you.
All right. Just to add, I think this is a great question as well. I think there's one partnership that's developed recently. It's called the Risk Informed Action Partnership, REAP, and they're looking at a number of different aspects of this, and I think are more proactive, and particularly looking at, again, anticipatory action. I'll go back to kind of disaster risk modeling in particular, and how we're overlaying that with some of the data that you saw earlier as well, with the fragile states and with the conflicts that are taking place, how we do that and how we bring together into these partnerships, not just the usual entities that are involved in this at the international level, but as we've discussed a lot in terms of the local community level, but also non-traditional actors. So that I think the banks and other international financing mechanisms associated with this are going to be really important to consider. I think the private sector is another entity that's really important to consider in terms of how they're engaged in a really proactive way. So just to highlight some of the partnerships that are good, such as REAP, and then also the need to go outside of our normal operating spaces, if you will, and partnership spaces. Harvard.
Thank you, Langdon. Elise?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to add further complexity to this dynamic, I think there's not only sort of a lag between the recognition of the challenge and the sort of development of funding mechanisms that Andrew speaks to, but I think there are also some really interesting inconsistencies. So one study we're doing at the moment at CIPRI, we've been looking at how some sort of European member states are thinking about the connection between climate change and conflict. And if we look at Germany, for instance, we can see that Germany has been very active on the topic in the UN Security Council, also domestically in the European Union. So they're really trying to, raise awareness about the connection between this and the risk, and we need to do something to address this now so it doesn't, spill into much larger security issues further down the track. But if we actually look at sort of the development cooperation focus, from the German government, they've recently included good governance as sort of a requirement for their development aid. So of course, on the one hand, you say, we're concerned about fragility and climate. And then on the other hand, they say, but the money that we spend, we only, provide to countries that have a minimum standard of good governance. There's obviously a huge contradiction there. So I think that's also something that is really hard to navigate. How do you match that in a sense? So there are real inconsistencies, I think, especially when it comes to climate finance.
Absolutely, thank you, Elise. And in any field that is dangerous, and when you're trying to push boundaries, you're struggling with the accountants, right? That is the safety that is required from an accountancy perspective often holds the financing in a lot of the projects, and especially doing it in environments where you just don't have that at all, right? Holds that back. There's a very weak mechanisms for that. Kelly, did you want to, you had your hand up at some point. Do you want to go? Do you want to pose your question, please? Go ahead, Kelly.
Yes, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm actually not right in the ordinary. I see things a bit deeper, and I just want to post a little bit of my worries because I was very impressed by Boletino's presentation, and with the questions coming up and nobody's speaking, I said, okay, probably let me say something that's within me. And I thought of disaster, and it came to me like, we're talking about conflicts and peace building, and we have natural disasters, but there's something that I feel is still lacking. How did we get to the stage or the position of natural disasters? Because the first thing is that we have to start looking at disasters from the internal perspective of the individual human being, because I believe that we have the physiognomy and the physiology of a human being, which needs to be addressed. There's a lot of studies, a lot of scientific research that envisages to attack the outcomes of what comes from the inside. But I don't see that much that is coming to address the causes of what brings the outcomes. Because I think the challenges of disasters, natural disasters that we're having, most is caused by man. Why is it caused by man? Is it that man is doing things that are harmful to the society? What can we do to arrange man in such a way that man should be able to avoid harming the society or to repair the damages? We are trying to repair the damages, but we are not telling the individual human being, we are not trying to reconstruct ourselves as individuals, what we should do, what is our responsibility, where did it go wrong, what are we supposed to do in reality in us. We study the consequences, we study the outcomes, we try to fight from the outcomes. But I think the key focus, what I'm thinking is what I'm just thinking, the key focus is within the individual. We should struggle as much as possible to make sure that we remove the disaster nature within ourselves as individuals. From there, now we'll be able to reflect the outcomes of scientific research and all the rest. So my own reflection was just that what is being done to address the nature of the individual.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And that relates very much to the first question we had, right? This is a question of scale in a way. And one way of putting that is, how is prevention? How can we anchor prevention in the individual, right? So does anyone want to speak to that? I mean, in a way, Enzo, for example, said that all of these levels are important, right? That from the individual up. But is a lot being done other than trainings to prevent individual or to shape individual choices in such a way that neither conflict nor disasters occur? I mean, it sounds like a revolution of the mind is required, right? Does anyone have a?
I mean, I'm happy to just, it's complicated, obviously, because every person, every individual human being is different. However, I think there's some interesting things to explore there. And one would be to look at sort of the ethical dimension of things. What is a person's individual responsibility to themselves, to their families, and to their communities, to be focused on these things. So I think the ethics piece is important. And then another piece that I think that is important is understanding sort of the psychosocial impact of exposure to both conflict and disasters. and understanding what the mechanisms are, and understanding basically how that impacts the individual and the individual's ability or capacity to be able to prepare for future disasters. So at least those are two dimensions. There are many more, I think, that can be and should be investigated. But I would go back to what you just mentioned, Siad, which is there are multiple dimensions to this, and it's not only the individual alone, but communities, families, governments that bear responsibility and they have different sets of things that they can do. But the individuals also, that's an interesting question. The individual does have some level of agency there and responsibility as well.
Anyone else? Langdon, are you unmuted? Do you?
Yeah, just to offer, obviously it is complex and it's such an important part of this entire equation. I do think that there is a digital, obviously, transformation that is taking place globally, and that digital transformation is allowing us to connect with people at an individual level like we never have before. We can really start to understand in these contexts where they were prior to the disaster, where they are currently, how their needs are evolving as a result of the whatever crisis or situation it is. And so that digital transformation is connecting us with people in ways that we had never had the opportunity to before. That's creating voice, that's creating an opportunity that we're just starting to really, I think, recognize and really connect with in a significant way. So just to put that forward, that digital transformation to a certain extent is leaping us all ahead in terms of our understanding and ability to connect in ways that we haven't previously. Over.
Thank you, Langdon. That's great. Elise, there's actually a question for you in the chat. And the question is about conflict-sensitive climate adaptation, one of the holy grails of the field at the moment. And lots of people are working on it and quickly developing approaches. But there's a question. So the question is, what are the tools and frameworks that are being used, if they are being used? Because you said quite a lot that they're probably not being used very much. Or is it all on an ad hoc basis? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, thank you. That's a really great question. I mean, what we did in our study was not really to look at what is happening in practice, is more how, what is reported in the literature. So I would love to sort of look on the ground and see, you could pick one of the big climate funds and follow their projects, or you can pick a bilateral donor and follow their projects and see what kind of tools they're using. But I don't know the answer to that. There are a few tools out there specifically for conflict-sensitive adaptation planning. So I think the one that I'm aware of that's sort of the most developed is from the German, essentially the German Environment Protection Agency, Umweltamt in German, that was developed largely by colleagues from Adelphi, which is sort of a guideline trying to follow, what do you do if you want to plan for conflict-sensitive adaptation. There's also some recommendations from Klingendale, which is a think tank based in the Netherlands. And then I think also Katie Peters from ODI has developed some recommendations how to, make some of these interventions more climate sensitive. I don't know to what extent these tools are used. And I would sort of mention the caveat that the knowledge bases for these are not very substantive. So I think they're tools, they're good, we need to try them out, but we also need to monitor and learn whether they're actually effective and efficient, and to what extent they're actually specifically focusing on participation or participatory approaches, which I think was the second part of your question, Giovanni. I'm not sure. So whether they're really focused on this localization agenda that Langdon was speaking about at the beginning. So a bit of a vague answer, but I think I hope I touched on some of your questions.
No, actually a great answer and really good overview of the tools that are out there from what I understand too. So exactly the organizations to look for. But in a way, this is also one of the areas that people are really focusing in on at the moment. So there's a lot of organizations in this sort of wide field of environmental peace building that are looking at tools, including CDA. So we're working on a paper at the moment that will suggest some practical guidelines, heavily rooted in participatory approaches. Of course, because that's all we ever do. And once again, Elise is absolutely right. we're making suggestions, but we haven't implemented a lot of this. So we haven't collected data, we haven't monitored the outcomes yet. And so I think to get to what you're asking for, which is what a lot of people really need and want, means a couple of years at least of implementation of these different frameworks and monitoring and adjusting. So far as I can tell, they are not heavily participatory. So thank you. We have 8 minutes. Is there any other questions from anyone? Otherwise, I'd open it up to any questions from the three of you towards each other, or any sort of topics you'd like to just put out there and we get to discuss them from any of the panelists or from anyone else really. But if there's no question from the audience coming in, then from the panelists, any idea you want to put out there that we can brainstorm, think about? Is there anything that you think that this particular group of people in 6 minutes could enlighten something that of gravest concern to you for a very long time?
One thing I'm curious about is whether there's a specific context, country, region, where there's a greater density of people exploring sort of the interlinkages between conflict, climate change, disaster risk reduction.
Yeah, actually, it's actually one of the big critiques of the research is that it is very much Sahel, Sub-Saharan Africa and Sahel based, and a little bit Middle East. There's actually huge lack of data from other areas of the world. So that's where most of the evidence comes from, most of the data comes from. And they're, of course, ecologically, culturally, in terms of fragility and conflict, very particular areas. So we're looking at very specific region to extrapolate data. And so one of the reasons why we had this environmental peace building in the Asia Pacific conference in November was in order to add these voices to it and to see what we can learn about the, what can we learn about this discussion from the Asia Pacific. And we actually have a blog post at the CDA website that's sort of really a one-pager that distills some of these ideas. What does this part of the world, and I know you work in the Philippines, and the Philippines amongst all the Asia Pacific is the one country that's been studied the most. But despite the fact that low-lying island states turn up in all climate discussions, they haven't really turned up at this intersection in terms of data. So yes, there's a huge bias that we need to address.
And maybe just to add to that, I mean, one thing that we noticed, and again, this is more about adaptation rather than DRR, but that there's a real focus on rural areas. And I think in some ways that, makes sense, but if we look at a lot of fragile or conflict affected states, there's obviously also huge populations living in urban areas. So I think there's sort of a big blind spot there as well. There's maybe a little bit of connection looking at the migration sort of pathway, but I think there's a real lack trying to understand, especially if you think about disasters. I mean, if you live in an urban area, that there's huge repercussions and potential tension. So I think that's another area. We need that geographic spread, especially in Oceania, but also, I mean, North America and Europe, there's not much research. I mean, of course, it's not necessarily conflict affected, but we also have huge, some social tensions and differences in terms of power balances in some of these contexts. But yeah, I think also the urban context needs more attention.
Anyone else? We have 5 minutes to the burning question at the back of your mind that we can all solve together. Langdon, I know you have several. I can see it on your face.
I've got a million questions coming out of this one, but it's really for you, Simon, and others who have been organizing impacts, and how this evolved. Where does this discussion go from here? What is the action steps, if you will, coming out of this discussion in terms of not only this conference but future conferences, and how do we support that? How do we engage in a meaningful way to enable and facilitate that continued focus, because it's essential from my perspective. Over.
Thank you, Langdon. I think there's different levels sort of a fora. So at CDA, we're doing a small piece of that, and Enzo is a little bit involved in it, but we will involve a lot more people. So we're just starting. We looking at environmental peacebuilding more broadly, but really collecting case studies from across the world to look at this, right? This is what we do. We collect case studies and do comparative work and analysis. So that's starting. So that's certainly in our organization what's happening, but there is very, very many different, at different scales, different engagements. One of the things that happened as part of this conference is a white paper and a whole collection of the future of environmental peacebuilding came out that Enzo and I wrote a chapter for, but it's 50 chapters and it's so rich. It's really, I encourage everyone to have a look at this. The opening white paper is brilliant and it talks across many of the things that we've been talking about. And because the paper is about the future of it, each chapter has a little suggestions, way forward section, right? So, but does anyone else know of similar sort of larger fora where this is being discussed? DRR and peacebuilding. I know that everyone is kind of talking about it comes up a fair bit here and there, but is there one sort of central place where people talk about this?
This seems to be the only dedicated place that that I'm aware of. It's definitely a conversation in other areas, but not. I can't think of anywhere that's sort of dedicated to it.
I think in terms of watch this space, ODI would be the place, right? But Elise, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in there.
No, I mean, this initiative that I mentioned at the beginning, the Environment of Peace, is also trying to develop some recommendations, but they would be much more sort of high level orientations, recommendations. So not so much the local level, I think. But it builds on a report that came out a few years ago, A Climate for Peace, I think it was called. So this is sort of the sequel, so to speak. Some of the same people are involved. So I think that will, bring up some of these recommendations, but more at high level. So if you're interested in that, keep a lookout for it.
And I think we are at the end of our time. And I really, really want to thank our panelists and give you an applause. It's been great. It's been great working with you. It's been a really fun hour and a half in many ways. And we have many connections already. And I think one way to take this forward is for us to keep on having this discussion, right? There's many things coming up, and everything that is coming up, I will start to involve you into and the broader community. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your time. Thank you for thinking across silos, right? Which we all need to do more. And, watch these spaces. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Booker, for your support. And thank you for giving us this opportunity. Have a great day, everyone. Great evening.
And thank you to you, Syed, for convening this roundtable.
Thank you so much, Elise.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.